July 1944. World War II still raged across Europe and the Pacific. Yet 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered at a secluded mountain resort in New Hampshire, not to plan military strategy, but to redesign the architecture of global finance. They called it cooperation. They promised prosperity for all. They spoke of preventing the economic disasters that had led to war. But within those 22 days of negotiations, a system was born that would trap entire continents in cycles of debt lasting generations. Today, developing countries owe a record $8.8 trillion in external debt. They paid $1.4 trillion in debt service in 2023 alone, money that could have funded hospitals, schools, and infrastructure. How did nations escaping colonialism end up in financial chains? The answer begins in Bretton Woods. Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where we uncover how money, power, and history intertwine to shape the world we live in. The Mount Washington Hotel. Elegant, isolated, the perfect venue for remaking the world. Two men dominated the conference. On one side, John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist alive, representing a declining British Empire desperate to preserve its influence. On the other, Harry Dexter White, a self-made American Treasury official representing the new superpower, the United States. Both men drafted plans to provide financial assistance to countries facing balance of payments deficits, aiming to prevent the protectionist policies that had devastated the 1930s. But their visions diverged sharply. Keynes proposed an international currency union, essentially a global central bank that would create its own currency, Bancor, to lend generously to deficit nations. His plan placed equal adjustment burdens on both creditor and debtor nations. It was built on flexibility, on sharing responsibility. White's plan was different. His International Stabilization Fund would place the burden of adjustment squarely on deficit nations, on the debtors. It imposed strict limits on borrowing, but no limits on the surpluses wealthy nations could accumulate. The final agreement followed White's approach far more than Keynes's vision. The conference produced two institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank. Both institutions formally came into existence on December 27, 1945. Countries agreed to fix their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. The United States, holding 2/3 of the world's gold reserves and an untouched industrial base, stood at the center of this new order. Keynes had fought for balance. He lost. And in that loss, a question remained unanswered. What happens when poor nations need capital, but the system is designed to favor creditors? Initially, the Bretton Woods system worked, at least for its intended beneficiaries. Europe received massive reconstruction aid. Japan rebuilt. The United States exported both goods and capital. The system of currency convertibility that emerged from Bretton Woods lasted until 1971. But for newly independent nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the story was different from the start. During the 1970s, two large oil price shocks created current account deficits in many Latin American countries. Oil prices quadrupled after 1973. Nations that had just escaped colonial rule suddenly faced crushing import bills. At the same time, oil-exporting countries accumulated vast surpluses. Those petrodollars needed somewhere to go. Western commercial banks, encouraged by their governments and the IMF, became willing intermediaries, recycling oil wealth into loans for developing nations. Between 1975 and 1982, Latin American debt to commercial banks increased at a cumulative annual rate of 20.4%. The borrowing seemed rational: build infrastructure, industrialize, catch up to the developed world. Latin American countries quadrupled their external debt from $75 billion in 1975 to more than $315 billion in 1983, 50% of the region's GDP. Mexico borrowed heavily against future oil revenues, but those loans were denominated in US dollars. When oil prices collapsed, Mexico's ability to repay evaporated. Then Paul Volcker, chairman of the US Federal Reserve, raised interest rates aggressively to combat American inflation. By 1981, global interest rates had soared. Suddenly, short-term loans that developing nations had planned to refinance came due, at drastically higher rates. The debt wasn't just growing, it was becoming unpayable. August 12, 1982, Mexico's Secretary of Finance, Jesus Silva Herzog, sent letters to the country's creditors stating that Mexico did not have adequate foreign currency reserves to make interest payments due the following Monday. He closed Mexico's foreign exchange markets and immediately contacted the heads of the IMF, the Federal Reserve, and the US Treasury. Mexico's total debt had reached $80 billion. The country declared it could not meet its obligations. Within months, the crisis spread like contagion. Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela. Eventually, 16 Latin American nations and 11 other developing countries rescheduled their debts. Between 1982 and 1985, Latin America paid back $108 billion, but economic growth collapsed. Real wages in urban areas fell between 20 and 40%. What followed became known as the Lost Decade. The IMF's response transformed the institution fundamentally. The IMF underwent a transformation its managing director, Michel Camdesus, termed a silent revolution, fundamentally altering its lending approach. The answer was structural adjustment programs, SAPs. These programs demanded that borrower countries privatize state sectors, commodify public goods like education and healthcare, eliminate government deficit financing, and remove barriers to foreign capital and trade. Want a loan? Sell your public utilities. Cut health and education spending, open your markets, remove food subsidies. The conditions were presented as necessary economic reform. But in Zambia, structural adjustment reforms of the 1980s and early 1990s included massive cuts to health and education budgets, introduction of user fees for basic health services and primary education, and cutting of crucial programs such as child immunization initiatives. The pattern repeated across continents. The debt crisis provided the IMF and World Bank with unprecedented leverage to reshape entire economies. Over 70 developing countries underwent similar comprehensive restructuring. But here's what few understood at the time. The debt wasn't being reduced. It was being refinanced, restructured, rescheduled. Interest kept accumulating. Principal kept growing. The system designed at Bretton Woods, placing adjustment burdens on debtors while protecting creditors, was working exactly as architected. Fast forward to today. Global public debt reached a record high of $102 trillion in 2024, with developing countries accounting for $31 trillion, growing twice as fast as in developed economies since 2010. In 2023, developing countries spent a record $1.4 trillion to service their foreign debt, with interest payments surging by nearly a third to $406 billion. A record 61 developing countries now allocate 10% or more of government revenues to interest payments. And 3.4 billion people live in countries that spend more on interest payments than on either health or education. The COVID-19 pandemic made everything worse. Countries borrowed to survive the crisis. Then, global interest rates surged again. As of March 2021, 85% of the 107 COVID-19 loans negotiated between the IMF and 85 governments indicated plans to undertake austerity once the health crisis subsided. Structural adjustment never truly disappeared. It simply changed names. Since 2022, foreign private creditors have received nearly $13 billion more in debt service payments from the poorest economies than they disbursed in new financing. Money flows out when it should flow in. Multilateral institutions like the World Bank became a lifeline, pumping in nearly $51 billion more than they collected in debt payments. But this isn't generosity. It's preventing total collapse. The Bretton Woods institutions have become lenders of last resort for a system they helped create. A system where those least able to afford debt pay the highest interest rates, where economic crises become opportunities to impose policy conditions, where sovereignty itself becomes negotiable. 80 years after Bretton Woods, the fundamental architecture remains. Creditor nations and institutions hold power, debtor nations adjust, and the cycle continues. 3 things to remember about the treaty that shaped our world. First, Bretton Woods wasn't a neutral technical agreement, it was a power play. Harry Dexter White's plan prevailed because the United States held the gold, the military strength, and the economic leverage. The architecture was designed to benefit creditors, not balance interests between rich and poor nations. Second, debt isn't just an economic tool, it's a mechanism of control. From structural adjustment in the 1980s to austerity conditions today, debt gives external institutions the power to reshape domestic policy, override democratic decisions, and redirect resources from development to debt service. Third, the system persists because it serves those who designed it. When developing nations are perpetually in debt, they remain dependent. They open their markets. They accept conditions. They cannot challenge the rules. The delegates at Bretton Woods spoke of cooperation and prosperity for all. Perhaps some believed it, but the system they built has done something else. It has institutionalized financial hierarchy, where entire continents are locked into cycles of borrowing, repayment, and re-borrowing that never end. The mountain resort in New Hampshire seemed like an unlikely place to determine the fate of billions. But in those 22 days, in those careful negotiations between White and Keynes, in that decision to favor creditors over debtors, a pattern was set. And that pattern echoes still. Because in the timeline of wealth, every rise comes with a hidden cost, and someone, somewhere, always pays. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon. Because history's next secret is already unfolding.